joining us today. And I want to begin by acknowledging that we're all standing on the land of First Nations people. I'm on Pangarang Yorta Yorta country, and I've had my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and recognise that this has been a continuous culture who's managed climate and heat in the most extraordinary ways, although the very short time that we've been occupiers of this country, we've certainly changed it fundamentally. So today we really wanted to focus on how we think about climate change, adaptation and mitigation, and with a particular emphasis on heat and how we think about what we need to do as organisations, as community members and as individuals to help us manage heat. We all certainly want to live in a healthy, fair and equitable, sustainable planet and communities. And what we know is that there are three things we need to do: reduce our reliance on fossil fuels, improve the resilience of both the built and the natural environment, and improve the way that we as humans respond to what will continue to be unpredictable and often catastrophic natural events until we cool the planet down a little. And what often sometimes gets overlooked in that discussion is the impact of heat. We tend to be more aware and have a lot more media around the big events, clearly because they're incredibly difficult for us to manage. But we've just come to the 13-year mark of the Black Saturday bushfires in 2009. And, you know, we know the date those bushfires started, the 7th of February, and we know that 164 people lost their lives in those fires, with devastating consequences for communities. Before those bushfires, though, was the longest heat wave that Victoria has experienced. And those heat wave conditions were found to be responsible for about 360 deaths. So a much greater number of deaths, and yet that heat wave event is not something that we acknowledge in the same way that we acknowledge bushfires. And so it's a really interesting conundrum that we need to be aware of is this extraordinary impact of heat. And before the pandemic, we could say that heat waves were the greatest natural disaster to affect people. But of course, COVID is rewriting all of the history books. But putting pandemics aside, it is heat that is the fundamental, has the most fundamental impact on people. And we know that its impacts are felt more by older people. So in the cases that we have that have been reported to a coroner, the most amount of deaths caused by heat waves that are reportable to a coroner occur in Victoria. So over 50% of all deaths across Australia happen in Victoria. And 70% of those are in people over the age of 60. And they're more likely to occur in dwellings. So they're not necessarily, there are a small number that have taken place in cars or out working or exercising, but the majority of them have been in dwellings, and those have been older buildings as well, so buildings built before 2006. And interestingly, in the report of deaths to the coroner, of the people that died, almost half of them had done nothing different in their lives before their death. So they hadn't made any adaptation to the heat wave and heat wave conditions. The coroners describe it as business as usual. So that gives us that great opportunity to think about both how do we address heat from a community perspective? How do we look at buildings and urban design and those sorts of aspects of managing heat? How do we think about the way we work during heat? How do our organisations manage and open themselves up to changing practices in heat waves? And also, what do we do as individuals during those heat waves, particularly for those people who are over 60 and, more importantly, those over 75. So the death rate dramatically increases the older you get. So that's where we'd like to have this conversation, and we're really glad to have you join us, and we certainly welcome your comments and suggestions as well. But I want to start with you, Erin. Gateway Health reached out to Upper Hume PCP to ask us to come up with some information sheets, particularly but not solely for older people, to support your work. So can you talk to me a little bit about what led you to make that request, and what your experience of working with the people who come to your service during heat is?
Yeah, sure. So we work with a lot of people over 65 in our team, delivering allied health and nursing services, as well as social support groups. So we're very closely with a lot of older people and a lot of quite vulnerable older people. And part of our planned response to heat waves and heat health alerts issued by the department is making sure we're getting in touch with our vulnerable clients and providing some education, but also trying to do that proactively. So for our social support groups, we deliver a quarterly newsletter. So we're keen to put some proactive information for our clients about heat health and what they can do to support themselves. But it's also when we are experiencing heat waves, how can we educate our clients to be making sure they're looking after themselves at the same time as well.
So when you, as an organisation, what do you change with when those heat health alerts come in? What sort of response do you have, both for your staff and for the client group?
Yeah, so very good question, and we have a procedure specifically for this. So when within our team as well as within the broader organisation. So I don't know if everyone's familiar with the heat health alerts that the department issues, which are issued when you have a number of days above a certain temperature and high overnight temperatures as well. So we will get notified by the department of a heat health alert, and that triggers a response within our team. So we, within our team, talk about and plan and review all the services that we're delivering in that time. So, and it's not clear cut, as are most things, as to whether we cancel services or change services, because so a lot of our social support groups are exercise programs, and your first thought is that it's probably suitable, would be appropriate to cancel exercise programs in hot weather. But a lot of our clients are actually living in homes that are really warm, and it's a reprieve to come into the centre and have some time in the air-conditioned building. But how do they travel into the centre? Are they going to get really hot travelling in, or do we transport them in our air-conditioned bus? So there's a whole lot of planning and consideration that's not clear-cut, black and white. Depends on knowing who the clients are, where they live, how they're going to travel. Is their home cool, or is it cooler for them to come into us? We certainly change the services that we deliver. So instead of a normal exercise program, it becomes more of a social support group than an exercise group, so that we're not exerting people. And then a lot of the other work we do is going out to visit people in their homes. So how do we make sure our staff are safe? They need to take water with them and make sure that they're not travelling in or doing things in the hottest part of the day, but likewise for our clients. So what sort of visits are they doing? Can they be changed to the morning? We don't want to be doing community access on a hot day in the afternoon. But does the client have a cool house, so it's still appropriate to keep doing what we're doing? There's a lot of decision making that's very individualised to the client. If we're cancelling a service because it's not appropriate to deliver it, what can we do to support the client and make sure that they are cool in their home, or they know what they should be doing to look after themselves, or they can access some support? We do a lot of welfare checking on some of our particularly vulnerable clients. Yeah.
So it's interesting that the heat it's not just a clear cut, this is the level and this is what you do. It's a much more nuanced response, which I think is interesting because, as we know, older people themselves are extraordinarily diverse. And as I'm interested to hear from Lachlan. Many of our farmers are certainly over 65 and are running properties through heat waves as well. So, they're the staff and our agricultural industry as well as our clients. So, Lachlan, heat equals drought often in this country, and it affects the quality of the water. We know that climate change is meaning that we've got often less water certainly in our region that is very agricultural reliant, and it also increases waterborne diseases, and we're all enjoying these enormous mosquitoes we've got after the beautiful rains we've had this summer. So what does it mean both for your work in the Catchment Management Authority as well as for farmers and farming communities that you work with when we do have these protracted periods of heat?
Yeah, thanks, Kathleen. I think you've summed it up. Heat is one of the pieces of the recipe that usually brings hardship to agricultural communities. Just going back to your comment too about the average age of farmers, we did some socioeconomic work about 18 months ago at the CMA, and the average age of farmers in northeast Victoria is 64. So, if you're talking about, you mentioned earlier that's high level propensity for deaths. The demographic that represents farming is very much in that space. I guess just going back a step, we've done considerable climate modelling in partnership with a range of people, CSIRO and the Intergovernmental Panel for Climate Change. The northeast climate is probably potentially by 2050 going to be 2 degrees warmer. That mightn't sound like a lot, but it's accumulated heat that causes the problem, and obviously adaptation to that situation. But it's not so much the 2 degrees which people seem to be able to weather, it's the extreme events and the length of those extreme events that are outliers to the statistics and very hard to model, that I think cause the issues around heat. And as Erin said in her presentation, fair to say those extreme days and the nights that don't cool down, I should say. And I'm not sure what the figures are, above 35 maybe during the day and above 20 at night. Animals, plants, and humans don't cope well with that, and so consequently, we have these stresses. I guess so the modelling is one thing, but I think some of the commentary around climate change is these extreme events, and obviously floods, fires, heat waves, wind and storm and tempest and so forth potentially are going to increase. So I think it's around supporting our community members adapt as best we can to those changes. Nonetheless, farmers are very stoked people, but and perhaps too much at times. But we've just done some interesting work with the wine industry about how they're going to adapt to climate change. And you know what? Out of the 85 people that came to those workshops across the region, only one farmer put their hand up and said, "What's that stress going to mean for me and my workers? How are we going to attract workers to the agricultural sector if you're exposed to these extreme events when you can potentially have an inside job, lovely air conditioning?" And so there's a whole big issue around recruitment and retention, and also trying to get staff to work in the sector. And so the industry really hasn't done much work on that space, it's fair to say. And I think it's often forgotten, the comfort factor around heat and extreme. So yeah,
it's interesting that you put it, you describe it as a comfort factor, and that's often the way we think about, trying to quantify, if you like, how heat is affecting us. Is this, am I comfortable? If you could say on a scale of 1 to 5 or something. But it is interesting that the research that has been done, and it's limited, that on any death reported to a coroner that was associated with a heat wave, that 43% of those people had made no change to their daily life because of the heat wave. And so what your feedback from your farmers is really replicating that, or probably figures are worse because only one out of however many were there. What do you think it might, how do we tackle something like that? How do we have farmers think that their health and well-being matters as much as the crop or the cows or the sheep?
Yeah, well, it's a different question. It's interesting. It's a bit like the frog in the boiling water, isn't it?
Yeah.
The frog doesn't know that, and I guess farmers, for instance, in this case, they don't even think about heat on their own health and good and well-being. And so maybe it's more the extreme events that brings people's attention to these, their health and well-being. And it's these outliers where you've got drought, like the millennial drought. You have following up bushfires. And then you usually the farmers who are affected by this are usually the frontline emergency responders.
Yes, yeah.
And so it's quite a wicked problem about, and I think work's being done like the CFA. I think it's becoming more mainstream, the thinking around this now. But nonetheless, anyone doesn't make good decisions when they're stressed. And fair to say, in these extreme events, farmers, like anyone else in the community, don't make the best decisions. I think that's well understood. And so how do you support that decision making? I think is really important. I think it's a question for everyone. How do we make sure that they make well-informed decisions, not only about the immediate threat and risk, but also the longevity of succession of farming families? There's a whole lot of work around that too. So, whilst it's lovely to have older people running farms, it's also good to have young people coming through. So there's some issues there as well. Anyway, I don't know what else I've got to say other than the fact that heat and exposure to the elements. There's skin cancer. There's the mental health issue. There's a whole range of other issues. And so, it needs a consolidated sort of approach, I think.
And it's interesting because Erin spoke about the complexity. Like you get a heat health alert from the department that, raises everybody's awareness, raises organisational awareness. And there isn't a simple path of to go down. So, Erin, thinking about that decision making that you go through with each and every client, if you were working with a healthy bunch of farmers who are over 65, it's like these two things have to come together. How might you do that problem solving about how to manage in the heat, or how to prepare for managing the heat? Because obviously we want to have some of these ideas in people's minds before the next heat wave.
Yeah, and certainly, I guess we do some planning with our clients about. I guess our clients are a little bit different; that they tend to be more vulnerable, so the conversations are different. But in terms of heat planning and fire planning, as like you said, people don't cope well under stress. With all of our clients in bushfire risk areas or really vulnerable to heat, we usually try and have conversations with them at the start of summer. What is your plan? Who are you going to contact? Are you going to stay at home? Are you going to leave? How are you going to leave? All of those sorts of things, so that they have a hopefully very clear plan before the event happens, so that they're ready to go. And if there's anything that we need to make, we're not the service that really is able to respond and support them in a critical situation. But if we're aware of what their plans are, certainly when there are fires, we do a lot of checking to make sure that whatever their plan has happened, or even when it's appropriate, having conversations with their family members to make sure that their family members are well aware of what the plan is, or what their needs are, or what their risks are, so that they can support them better as well.
It's interesting, again, it's like when we know there's an event like a fire, that planning's there. But heat waves, to use Lachlan's expression, like the frog in the water that's boiling. It's like, what is the trigger when you would put into place a heat management plan for yourself, let alone crops and cows and sheep and things. Lachlan, can we just also touch a little bit? I'm also sort of interested in water management during heatwave events and this change, and also I guess during flood events as well, because we are getting this shift of waterborne viruses and bugs and things that are coming. They seem to be coming down from the north to us. How aware do we need to be as communities and as organisations about the impact of water, that combination of water, heat, extreme events?
Yeah, sure. Just as an interest, I remember in the heat waves we had there in was it 09, and even I think more recently in 16, was it? Our power went out. The load on the power system was so great from memory, and so people who rely on power for cooling and even for dairies and every other industry, there's no access to power, and obviously if you talk about heat, that's a real issue. So the modelling we've done for the northeast, and the northeast, in a bit of context, supplies 38% of the Murray-Darling Basin. That's from our catchment area, and so if we couple us up with the Golden Broken area, it's 50% of the Murray-Darling Basin is caught in our catchments. The modelling suggests that by 2050 we'll have 30% less water yield than 2050 than we do today, and by 2030 we'll have 20% less water yield, and that's been borne out in all the statistics and water flows and yields. So that's a real, and one of the big issues we're working with in a range of institutions, Northeast Water, Golden Valley Water, the Murray-Darling Basin, about 15 institutions, is how we communicate that with our community. How do we communicate with them about the issue and try and support them to adapt to a low water future? There's no doubt, as I said, the statistics back this up, that it's happening. And it's really important that we have a unified voice there about, how do you change your farming system, for instance? How do you change your reliance on water? The other interesting aspect is the water quality, as you mentioned. And, in those drought years, bushfires, the water is absolutely polluted and not potable. A lot of those remote communities and people who rely on dams and also stream water for their housing and their animals and everything else, that water is not usable. And so that was really borne out in the Corryong fires in 2000. When were they? 1920, wasn't it? Yeah. I can't keep up with them.
Well, COVID's done funny things to our brains when it comes to time. But 2019, 2020.
Yeah. And so it's fair to say we've had 6 major fires in 20 years, 6 extreme events. And so obviously heat and drought are fairly responsible for that. And so it's all very much coupled. So the amount of water available, the quality of the water available, and the accessibility through people who might be poorer, who just rely on tank water. A lot of farming communities rely on tank water. If you can't afford to buy a $400 load of water, you're in serious strife. And so, so it's quite complex once again, but it's very hard to beat environment. So you have to adapt. We have to adapt. And that's the message we're putting out to our farmers and rural communities, is around leadership, trying to support leadership, so that the community is strong, and then trying to support that adaptation process, which the community needs to own, obviously.
If anyone would like to add a comment or ask a question or provide information, you're more than welcome to do so. This isn't Q&A. It really is a conversation. So it'd be really, pleased if you'd make a comment. James, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, just thought I'd be polite and put my hand up there. I think my question is just around food security. I think brings in both Erin and Lachlan there. Lachlan, you're mentioning around a low water future and pollution of waterways and that sort of thing through these extreme fire events. So, what effect does that have on either livestock or crops that we would end up eating? And then I guess for Erin, I would imagine that's going to increase food prices, and when you're working with a population who has a fixed income, any increase in food prices, particularly the healthier fresh fruit and vegetables, really starts to limit people's ability to buy and consume that food. And are you sort of seeing that already, and what sort of impact might that be having?
So would you like me to go first? The production end. It's a good question, James. As we've seen, inflation is roaring. And so the two greatest contributors to inflation, I believe, was food and fuel, I think, both pretty basic commodities for anyone. And so the food inflation is in fact reflecting the seasonal conditions that have led up to this situation. Fair to say, I went to the butcher shop the other day and fillet steak was the same price as flathead tails. Now that is an amazing situation, and so that is really a consequence of the droughts. The droughts in, when were they? 19, 19. I think there's 2 seasons there. The cattle herd was run down as a result of drought, and now we're seeing the result of that is that the price of meat has gone through the roof, and so consequently there's cause and effect, and our population in the world is targeting 9 billion. And so there's incredible demand on food and the staple products. So if you've got increased climate change and the effects of that and an increasing demand for food, it probably pushes prices up, I think it's fair to say. I might hand to Erin there. Yeah.
Probably not my area of expertise, but I know that we certainly provide a lot of our clients information about where they can access food at low cost or no cost through Food Bank and other such sources, and certainly do a lot of work linking people in with services where they can get support to access food. But I could not give you much detail about that, sorry.
Do you think that need for food, I mean, certainly food security has been something that's been on certainly the government's agenda, and we've had food banks established. Is there likely to be an interplay between, we know that climate change affects the poor disproportionately more than it does people who have the capacity and income to either make the changes they need. So is it likely that that's going to be something organisations going to have to be in the health and community sector more cognizant of, that ability to buy food when it will increase, along with fuel as well, which is, for rural communities, they are basic.
Yes, I think sorry, I don't have much to say. I do know that some of the services that we deliver and some of the cooking courses that we deliver for older people here through our dietetics team also have a focus on sourcing healthy, cheaper food. So there's certainly a cost element in the education that we provide, so that people are learning skills about how they can access healthy food that they can source at a reasonable cost and make themselves. Yeah.
Just an interesting add-on, Kathleen. I think there's like 20 or 30% of the food produced is wasted. It's a very high figure. I can't tell exactly what it is, but that's a figure that's sort of in my mind. I see a lot of good work being done about trying to reduce that. Whether it's, I can't tell you the institution, but there's a lot of institutions being set up to utilise food that's old or out of date or whatever out of restaurants. And there's one of the great opportunities, if ever there was, to try and reduce the price of food, is reduce that level of wastage. And really, we need to be really smart about how that's done. I don't have the answer for it today, but I see a lot of things popping up, and that's probably would support a lot of people who can't afford. It's a stretch to get good quality food. Yeah.
Jackie.
Thanks, Kathleen. I agree with everything that has been said, and certainly the role of organisations like Gateway Health. There's a clear role, there's a lack of clear funding in order to be able to do something within that role. So that is something that we are advocating for in joining all of these dots around of the impact of communities realising their food insecurity. A really good one is Corrion post the bushfires, and the development of the Acres and Acres food co-op, which is now providing fresh food grown locally in the Upper Murray from Bafanga to Tumbarumba. So that takes volunteers and grants and a whole lot of work to get it going, and that has taken a life of its own, which is fabulous to see. the work that a number of organisations and councils and schools and health promotion teams are doing through establishing community gardens, things like, teach a man to fish kind of metaphor. Again, it takes volunteers and people to drive it and people to keep going and manage it and then distribute the food. The work that's been done even in regional areas around food deserts where there is no fresh food. So all of that work has happened. There's just sort of a lack of, at this point, government capacity to really fund ongoing roles to make that really drive forward and enable community leadership, rather than always waiting for, as Lockie was saying, the extreme event and then relying on those volunteers to step up and do something else in that space when they're trying to get their own lives back in order. So whilst those extreme events have been a catalyst, we really want to be looking with that adaptation lens of what we can do in between the extreme events.
Yeah, thanks. It is that both that need to do the adapting and mitigation before the extreme events, but then manage the extreme events. And in that management, and you've posted a question in the chat. Do you want to speak to that? Or will I ask it for you? So, yes. So, Anne noted that she previously worked outdoors during harvest, and she identifies with the frog slowly boiling analogy. So, drinking small amounts of regular water, sips of soft drink helped, but what advice is being given to outdoor workers to manage heat events? And I think, Lachlan, it gets to your point about while farmers have certainly got their eyes clearly open on mitigation for animal and land, it's people as well that need that adaptation. So your advice for outdoor workers?
Farmers are an interesting lot. They're incredibly stoic, and they push themselves to the limit more often than not. And so, whether they have a healthy regard for their own health is a reasonable question. Maybe there's some work required around educating farmers to look after their health. It's an interesting situation because they're self-employed, and so work cover really doesn't cover off on if you're self-employed, if you own your own business. And so, who's to care for the carer? So I do wonder whether there needs to be some work done in that space about what is good health and supporting farmers looking after themselves. I'll give you an example. I was pretty stupid one hot day. I was carting wine, as we said earlier. I didn't have a drink for about 6 hours, I reckon. And then next day I'm in hospital with kidney stones. So it was awful. And so that's what happens though. And so I think there's a whole bit of education, the piece there around, people looking after their own health, particularly farmers, as I say, they're a hard nut to crack at times.
So what sort of approaches do you think might be helpful so we've because it's always that balance between how do you work with individuals and what's the system that needs to change? What do we need to be doing to, as I said, reduce our reliance on fossil fuels, work to mitigate impact on the built and the natural environment, and also our own resilience to these events. So, not everything is about changing one individual, and it is about what are the systems that are holding that thinking in place, I guess.
I can only comment on the farming community. I don't want to comment on the broader community because I don't understand what their drivers are. But a great way to get, and I'm not saying, quite often farming families, the wife of the family is the farmer these days because people are working off farms so much. But nonetheless, I think women have an incredible role in training their partners or people around them to look after themselves better because it's usually them that sends them off to the skin cancer clinic or for their annual health check. And so that's just an observation. Take it as you like. Sorry, Kathleen.
Yep.
I don't want to get into trouble.
Well, So there needs to be that almost that individual approach at some level. You need to get down to an individual farming family to say, how are you managing yourselves and your workers? What is
Pretty
your
much.
heat management plan? Yeah.
That's right. And fair to say, none of them would have one. But if you're in a business in Albury, Wodonga, or, if you're working on an outdoor, Wodonga Council, I see are on the call, they'd have a heat management plan, I'm sure, for their outdoor staff. And so it's an education thing as much as anything, I'm guessing.
Yeah.
Kathleen, it's also a culture thing very much. I think there is a fair bit of information out there. There is that real culture when you sort of, particularly when you look at outdoor working industries, if the leadership of the industry are working shirts off in the sun and you lob up as the apprentice with your your t-shirt or your long sleeves and your high vis, and you take breaks to put the sunscreen on, the culture doesn't support health in the outdoor workplace at all. So there's not only just that individual stuff. I think there's a real role here for those peak bodies and the big employers to change that culture. How you do that in small business, as Lockie was saying, is really difficult, but it potentially has got to come a little bit from the ground up, from people coming through saying, I'm not going to work unless I have this, this and this in place because I know the consequences of. But I think we're a fair way off that yet.
Yeah, I think people aren't really aware of the consequences of heat waves. We still focus very much on, the numbers of people that died in bushfires or the damage from flood, but heat waves remain the sort of invisible killer. Robin, did you want to comment anything? I'm not sure what your role is in the City of Wodonga, so we're not asking you to speak on behalf of the City of Wodonga. But is there anything you'd like to add to the conversation about those organisational practices in heat?
Thanks, Kathleen. Yeah, sure. We do have a heat plan, Lockie, as you indicated. So, but that also is not just for our workers, but also for, we have a vulnerable persons register, and if there is issues around, then measures are in place. Pardon me, I am the sustainability coordinator, not the emergency management coordinator.
That's okay.
I can't give you any specifics necessarily, just basics around it, but I do know that they're contacted and measures are put in place with all the organisations to make sure that those people are taken into account and are safe. Obviously, on those days, our pools are opened up to the community, and if it's bad enough, then facilities like the Cube are opened, which are nicely air conditioned and support those that are either unable to pay electricity accounts in these times, or don't have it's not safe to stay at home or whatever. So there's quite a few measures that are in place, and it's council's also looking into different projects to plan our municipalities such that people can access these facilities safely down shaded streets or comfortable bus stops. Not that the bus service is too flash in Wodonga, I have to say. But there's a project that we're working with through the Goulburn Murray Climate Alliance. It's called Cooler Towns. And it is actually looking at how to try and make towns plan towards having, as it says, cooler facilities and cooler places to be. So we're working along those lines, and also we have some fact sheets around how to design your house with ESD principles, so ecologically sustainable development principles. There's some fact sheets on our website, just small things about passive solar orientation, eaves, planting of trees, those sorts of things to try and make the house itself more comfortable. Obviously, if people are renting, then things are a little bit trickier to do, but there are other measures to take in place with, you know, ensuring your blinds are down, those sorts of things, so that sun doesn't come in. Hopefully that helps.
It does. Thank you, Robin. I mean, it's interesting that, you know, I a few years ago heard the term nanotechnology. It's like what we need to do is to remember what our grandparents did, you know, before technology and managing things. So, you know, I grew up with, you know, wet sheets being put over the windows and, you know, the house really in darkness during the day. You know, we lived in a, I lived on an army camp. I grew up in an army camp. So, you know, very minimalist housing, but certainly before air conditioning, because as we talked about earlier, air conditioning is often not the answer anyway. The power goes out. Again, interestingly, in the coronial reports of deaths, there was a significant proportion who didn't use air conditioning. Again, it's an enormous cost. So even if it's there, it may not be used. It creates more heat in the outside environment. So it can actually cause greater localized temperatures, particularly if there's numbers of them in built up apartments and units. Robin, the ecological design principles are voluntary, so there's no mandated requirement for builders, particularly those building new estates?
Unfortunately, no. But there are some councils that do have ESD policies. I would like to see that come in, but we need a bit of community push for that one, I suspect. It would make a big difference. So when it comes to us working with developers, the planning regulations do have some guidelines to try and encourage. Probably would be the best way to describe how we work with developers. But we don't have, some things we can force them to do, or other things we just request, and it depends on what the developer chooses to do. So obviously, if we wanted to get lots aligned so that we could all utilise the passive solar principles that I was talking about earlier, developers would lose a lot of their earning capacity for the way they set up their development. So there's a few trade-offs, I guess, in that sense. But I think a lot of people don't quite understand that the orientation of their house makes such a massive difference. Quite often people just think that they need to set their house up so that it's facing the street, or that if they don't put windows on the west side of the building, it makes such a massive difference to their energy consumption. A lot of people don't understand those things, and we are trying to get word out. We've gone around to all of the builders in town and asked for them to distribute our fact sheets and those sorts of things, but it's how do we actually get those out into the community and try and encourage people that do, even dare I say, agencies that build houses and things, just trying to get them to build better. Yes, it's going to cost just that little bit more to build, but over the lifetime of the property, it's going to be far cheaper and much more comfortable for the client in the long run. So how do we try to work with agencies to actually consider those factors? That's something that makes me anxious, because it in my mind it's a relatively easy fix. I know it's more expensive, but over the lifetime of that building, it's definitely not. There's lots of evidence that states that if you build a house properly in the first place, it's more sustainable, basically.
Yeah.
Can I just add a few things to this particular theme? Russell Sully from Wangaratta Landcare and Sustainability adaptation to climate change is something that's a very high priority amongst what we're working on. We're just about to release 5 videos that have been constructed over the last 12 months, looking at case studies, the way people have adapted their living environment to a changing climate and to improve energy efficiency. And that was funded from a grant from under the Hume Region Climate Ready program. Over the last 2 years, we've in Sustainable House Month, September, October, we've written a number of articles for the local paper talking about ecologically sustainable principles. But in the last year, we wrote 9 articles of people talking about how they'd adapted their house and the way they live in the house to improve the thermal comfort and the energy efficiency as a total package. One of the issues that we're quite frustrated about is the way new subdivisions are being laid out and houses constructed, because there's still a hell of a lot of houses being built in Wangaratta with black roofs and facing the street, irrespective of which way north is facing. And we've tried to engage with some of the builders and developers, and you'd have to say it's a journey of discovery that we're all on in that space. We have just received a grant under the Hume Climate Ready program, looking at livability in a changing climate. And it's one of the reasons why I've connected in with you today, because Rowan O'Hagan drew it to my attention. And as we're just formed a steering group to guide that project. And the first phase of the project will be a round table with key influences within the region to identify what are the issues that need to be addressed around livability. And that will be followed by a forum and then a series of call to action sheets that we'll be distributing in various shapes and forms over the next couple of months. But to me, it is really quite an important topic, because there's been a lot of focus on mitigation and emissions reduction, but adaptation in some respects has been the poor cousin, and we're going to have to adapt even if we're effective in reducing emissions in the next 20 years.
Thanks, Russell. I agree, and I think it's you know, I live in the rural city of Wangaratta, and was told that it's against council regulations to have a light coloured roof. I mean, just small things that need to be changed. Can
I just add one other thing on that?
Sure.
There are the standards for housing construction is currently under review by the state government. And they're going to up the ante in terms of the thermal efficiency. We've been in discussion with the rural city around that for quite a while, and we've got great anticipation about what might be possible when they come out.
Terrific.
In terms of changing the game. But it'll be a small step, but an important step sometime this year, we hope.
Lovely. Russell, I'll also ask Naomi Peters to be in touch with you. Naomi's our communications manager, and we're certainly happy to you know, put your information through our social media channels as well. Bridie, can I just ask you, I know you're a resident of Yakandanda, and Yakandanda for a long time has been really at the forefront of community action in becoming sustainable and through its energy uses. So that obviously took both community leadership, but also changing attitudes as well. Can you talk at all about how that happened, or your understanding of how that happened and what lessons there might be for us in the work that we do.
Yeah, I can talk about it, not with a whole lot of authority.
I understand that.
Yeah, so Yakandanda, and I mean, there's other communities that have done this, but it was really driven from community to establish totally renewable Yakandanda, so that there would be renewable energy across, you know, all houses, and also some of the community facilities like the football netball club, service station, those sorts of things. So yes, there was a big push. There was grants. This group of people that kind of started it applied for grants to get things like the battery, and in some of the newer established houses in Yak to get the, and I don't understand that technology, so I can't talk about it, but to utilise also the battery as well. And I think it's grown over years, I would say, just a really, I mean, Yak has a fairly strong community volunteer group, I guess. There's a lot of people that really came together and really pushed that, which is great. The other thing about Yak that enables it to do it is that it does have, I mean, this technology isn't particularly cheap yet, and it's getting cheaper, but there are certainly barriers around who can access solar panels, for example, and that sort of thing. But a whole lot of things came together in our favour, I guess, in Yak, that there are a lot of people that could afford to buy the things that they needed to connect to the battery or just to get solar panels and things put on. We also have a grants program through our Yakandanda Community Development company, which gives grants to our local community groups. So I used to be on the football club committee, and we got grants to get solar panels, for example, for those facilities. So it was really a push broader than just individual houses, that community centres would get our service station. The profit, it's a community-owned facility, so the profits go back to shareholders, but also 50% of profits go into the community to those sorts of grants that provide those solar panels, for example, for the public hall and the football club rooms. So
it's that, you know, there's a whole lot of chance that comes together, as with anything, but also there's community members working together, looking at whatever monies, funds, grants are available, but also generating your own funds with an understanding that those who can't afford it need the support, and those that can afford it, off you go, do what you need to do. So
yeah, and I think that's just the push for solar and renewable energy is great, and there are different grants and things available for individuals and also you know, landlords and things like that. But just, I guess the key thing in amongst all that is it still isn't necessarily affordable for a lot of people. So while it's great and you know, to aim for, some communities just don't have the capacity for individuals and even for a community as a whole to fundraise and, you know, to be able to afford that kind of technology, which is why it's really important, you know, hopefully that we can push for more of those community grant type things for other communities as well.
Terrific. Well, thank you, everyone. It's been a really good conversation, very thought-provoking, and lots of areas where lots of work needs to happen, but I think there's also a lot of goodwill as well. Thank you, Erin and Lachlan, for agreeing to be conversationalists on this event as well. And thank you to James and Naomi for all of the work they did in pulling this together. I'm going to hand over to James to end the session. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Kathleen. And yeah, my thanks to Erin and Lachlan as well, and everybody who contributed. So the session today is just one of a number of events that we're doing at the moment under the banner of Reconnection. So this is a series of events that we're holding to really just bring people back around the table and discuss some of these key issues related to ageing and age-friendly communities across the Northeast. So we've got a few more events coming up, and I'm just going to share my my screen just so you can see the other things that we've got going on. Apologies, I'm just trying to find it in my, here we go. Sorry, I should just say that the heat health fact sheets, the Keeping Cool this summer fact sheets are available on our website. So as Kathleen said, that we developed these in partnership with Gateway Health, and these were really the driver for the conversation today. So you can see the link there. I'll put that in the chat in a second. But if you just Google Upper Hume PCP Keep Cool, those fact sheets will come up, and there's a longer version and then 2 summary versions that you can download and give to family members, clients, keep for yourself. They're really useful for a whole range of purposes. So in terms of the upcoming Reconnection events, we've got a few happening over the next month. So on the 22nd of February and the 1st of March, we've got a 2-part series on ageing, connection and participation. And this is really exploring the ways that different groups are supporting social connection and community participation for older people. And the first in that series is looking at projects from outside our region. So there's a wealth of stuff that happens across the state that we sometimes don't get an opportunity to hear about. So we've got 4 presenters from different council areas in different parts of Victoria, and they're going to be presenting on some of the work that they've been doing. So we've got a presentation on building age-friendly domains within seniors clubs, digital inclusion for older people, connecting through contribution, which is a really great project that Melton City Council was leading during some of the lockdowns over the past couple of years, and supporting clubs to be age inclusive. So this is looking at your sporting clubs, your general community clubs, and how they're trying to be more inclusive of older people, and what Latrobe City Council is doing to support that. The following week, we've got the same theme, but this time we're going to be looking at projects from within the Northeast. So we're still finalising the panel for that, but we're going to have a presentation from Charles Sturt University on walkability in Indigo Shire. And we're also going to have a presentation from Wodonga City Council around addressing social isolation for older people. So those are just 2 of the projects that we'll be looking at. And then coming up on the 8th of March, we're going to be having a forum, a panel discussion for International Women's Day on housing and older women. So older women are one of the fastest growing population groups experiencing homelessness and insecure housing. So we're going to have Fiona York from Housing for Aged Action Group and Dr. Kate Rayner from the University of Melbourne, who are going to be exploring that issue and really looking at some of the local solutions that local governments and people at the community level can be supporting. So we don't just have to see this as an issue that's outside of our control, that there are actual things that our local, that can happen at the regional and the local level. So those are going to be really fantastic. Everything's up on our website. The link is there again, that you can just follow and go through and register for each event. I'll just stop sharing. And coming up just after this, we will have our a discussion that follows on from this one, which just looks at, it's more of a conversation between practitioners around how climate change is actually shaping our work and how we're adapting to that. So I'd invite everyone to come along if you can. I'm just going to drop the Zoom link in for that into the chat. But it'd be really wonderful to see everyone there. And finally, it's great that Robin from City of Wodonga is able to be here, because I've been in touch with Robin and one of her colleagues, and Wodonga Council is actually reviewing its climate adaptation policy at the moment. It is really keen to hear from community around some of those climate change adaptation priorities. So there's a short survey that Wodonga Council's got up at the moment. I think it's got a few more days open, but you can follow the link there and put your thoughts in that survey. So I think that's it, Kathleen.
That's it.
So we'll have a couple of minute break before we start the practice conversation, just so everyone can get a coffee and quick toilet break, and we'll switch over to the other Zoom link that's there.
Terrific. Okay, thanks everyone.